Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my session at Scottish Summit 2021. My name is Benni De Jagere, and I'm coming to you from Belgium. Right now, it's a Wednesday evening in the office, but I'm sitting here with the utmost pleasure because I get to do community stuff. That said, let's get cracking with the session because I do have a lot of information to share with you, and well, not a lot of time to do so. So let's get started. As I mentioned, my name is Benni De Jagere, and I'll be talking to you in the next, let's say, 45 minutes about how we can keep up with our Power BI Tenant Administration, which is a very important topic because I have seen it become a bit overlooked with some of the clients that I've run into. But before we do get on, we do have to thank our sponsors because I organize events myself as well, and I know that even for these free events, there are costs incurred as well. So these sponsors make it possible to have these sessions, to have this conference organized, and they enable you to learn free stuff at your own leisure, at the comfort of your own home. So please do say thanks whenever you get the chance, and yes, thank you sponsors, definitely. So my name is Benni De Jagere, as I've already mentioned, and I'm an enterprise data architect at a company called Inetum Reeldolmen. It's a French company, and we're the Belgian leg of that company, the international group. In any spare time that I sometimes have, I am engaged with datamines.be, which is a Belgian user group focused on Microsoft data and AI. If you want to reach out to me through the social channels, my social handles are included there as well. And since March 2020, I've become a data platform MVP. Fun fact, I got the news that I've become a data platform MVP the day I was traveling home from the Scottish Summit 2020. So it is a bit special for me as well. But what do I have in store for you? Tenant admins are usually, whenever I ran into them throughout my journeys as a consultant, they've become accidental tenant admins at the start. So especially in the beginning, dedicated resources were not all that common. It was usually someone that has some experience with another BI tool like SAP BO or Tableau or something like this. That was become, well, you're the SQL guy, so why don't you do the Power BI Tenant Admin? And especially the fact that Microsoft 365 has been around a bit longer inside of the Microsoft landscape, we've usually seen a bit more dedicated admins for the Microsoft 365 services, etc. But they're not always shared with the Power BI, the tenant admin side. So there is sometimes a big gap in between those two functions as well. And some people were able to lean on prior experiences with other BI tools or BI methodologies, but I have to admit that in the very early stages of the product, Power BI, it was a bit based on trial and error. Not really a lot of things were known about what was possible, what was coming, and it was a bit, well, let's try it and see if it works. If it sticks, great. If it doesn't, well, let's get back to the drawing board. And I've seen as well throughout the years that the maturity level in all enterprises across the globe, but also in the community global as well, has risen exponentially. There has been incredible efforts done to get information out there to people so that they can all get started with doing some proper tenant administration for their Power BI environment. However, Power BI is a moving target, and that is grossly understating it. Power BI is blazingly fast with its updates through the different channels, etc. And to illustrate, I've got this tiny little diagram that Melissa Coates has created. And Melissa Coates, data chick or SQL chick, she's created this single page diagram that lists most of the services that are around when we're looking at Power BI. It's called the end-to-end diagram. And this just underlines with a very thick line that Power BI has become huge and that it is very hard to effectively manage each and every single one thing that is in here. And that's not necessarily meaning that your company is using each and one of these things, but you'll probably see a lot of these things checked off in your environment. But it's a moving target, okay, sure. But what do tenant admins actually do? That's the big questions. And in some companies, admins in general are referred to as deities because they have all the power and we need to suck up to them. Other people say that admins just sit around there and say no to people. I'll leave that in the middle. The thing is that admins should, in my opinion, keep one thing in mind that is very important, and that is that a tenant administrator should strive to empower and enable a data culture in their organization. Because if they're just going to go about and restricting and disabling features without making sure that policies, processes, and people are in place to handle incoming requests, we'll see a massive chaos occur as well, because people are just going to try and find their own ways, and it's going to lead to even bigger chaos than what we're trying to handle as well. So it's not about saying no, it's about enabling. It's about making sure that people can do their actual work, that people can use the data they need to be using, they want to be using, but that they can do it in a structured and streamlined way to make sure that we're actually able to keep company secrets secret. But most importantly, tenant administrations cannot do it alone. That is the harsh truth. No one can do it on their own. But what do they actually do, these tenant administrators? And well, pretty much they do magic. They do magic. It's not all smoke and mirrors, but the thing is that tenant administration for Power BI has a lot of things that come into scope. And I'll show you a few of these things. Tenant admins usually occupy themselves with data management, data governance, security and compliance, change management, product integration, product solving, but most importantly, whatever else pops up. That's the thing. I've seen tenant admins also be referred to as some sort of a helpline, some sort of go-to where people could come and ask their questions. I've seen tenant admins that also had to do SQL development. I've seen tenant admins that were also the Office 365 admin and had to also deal with any Exchange problems that popped up. So it is not an easy life as a Power BI tenant admin. But there are some things that along the way I've picked up as a consultant, and I found that making sure that you can get a grip on these things, they can really make your life as a tenant admin easier. For instance, let's get started, the service health. The second someone comes up to me and says, hey Benny, this is not working, usually my reflex is to go check the service health. What is the Power BI service doing right now? Are there any issues? Is there something that we need to be aware of, etc.? Which usually leads to the fact that I'm checking it I'm checking it pretty much daily, if not more than daily. And there's a few things that come to mind for me. The first one being, for instance, the Power BI support page. The Power BI support page offers an overview of the different regions that are there and if there's any known issues at this moment. So usually there's always a few of these awareness things out there, but it's when we're seeing degradations and outages that it becomes a bit more critical. Outages, luckily, are very rare, but when they do occur, it's usually something to do with Azure Active Directory authentication or something along those lines. The Power BI service itself rarely goes down. But that means that if we're tied into different services, we probably also have to know what other Azure services are running and how they are working for the same way as well. Which means that we also have an Azure status page. And this Azure status page allows us to go browse region by region and look at specific things that we need to be aware of. For instance, do you have SQL data warehouses? Azure Synapse SQL pools on demand? Or do you have Databricks clusters running that you need to be aware of? These things also allow you to check these as well. But most importantly, it boils down to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, because this is tailored to your tenant. The two previous ones I've shown are on a global level, which means that if it's something individually with your tenant for some odd reason, you'll probably not see it out there on those two other pages, which means that the Microsoft 365 Admin Center is a really interesting one to keep an eye on, because it boils down to every single Microsoft 365 service that you can potentially have running and what the impact is for you. And yes, Luckily, I'll also show you. That's the good thing. So Power BI, the support page is just powerbi.microsoft.com/enus or whatever language you're using, and then support. Gives you an overview, but most importantly, it's about the Microsoft Admin Center. And I've included the link in the slide deck, and you'll get the slide deck as well. So usually you end up in the home page, you go over to the health bar, and then when you use the health bar, you click on it and you get your service health that you can go ahead and look at, which gives you an overview of all the different services that you have running. And right now I have no issues with my Power BI environment, which is a very good thing. The cool thing is as well is that I can go look at a history of things. Have I been having some issues with product X or service Y? It's all shown here. And then if you're looking at this, it'll give you a status, what the impact is, some detailed information, and when did it start occurring, and when did they resolve it with a small root cause. So very interesting information if you also need to report back to your local users. Cool, that's one thing. Let's get back to the slides. The thing is as well is service health is one thing. But for me personally, it is also about knowing what is happening on your tenant. And I've seen far too many tenant admins flying blind on this, that they weren't actually aware of what's being executed on their tenant, which potentially could lead to very icky situations if something goes awry. But the activity log for me is the treasure trove. It is the place where we need to be to find those really interesting details and informations. If you're not familiar with the Power BI activity log, it is a sort of specialized version of the Microsoft 365 or the Exchange audit logs that we have from Office 365, specifically tailored to the Power BI related events. In my experience, they are also far more stable and they offer a bit more details as well. They offer a bit more fields that currently weren't included in the Office 365 logs. The difference is that this data is only retained for 30 days, so you need to get it out there quickly. But we also require less privileges to get them. Because to extract the Office 365 audit logs, we had to have either global admin or at least a viewer role in the Exchange Security Center, Security and Compliance Center. To extract the Power BI activity log, it is enough to have the Power BI admin role. So there is no other connections needed to Office 365 privileges, which means if you have a gap between Office 365 admins and Power BI admins, it is far easier to get started with what you actually need. But most importantly, in my opinion, it is the key to many questions that you may have. But I'll quickly show you as well is what I usually do to start extracting these things. So I have a PowerShell script. It is nothing overly complex, which means that right now I'm authenticating through a service principal, which means that I'm not using a user. It is an Azure Active Directory application with a secret that by the time you're watching this will have long been changed already. But what I'll be doing is I'll be connecting to my Power BI service. So if I do this and execute this path, this means that I am now, as soon as this is over, I will be connected to the Power BI service, which means that I can start actually executing these cool little commandlets. For instance, the one that I'll be using for the activity logs boils down to the fact that I'll be calling the get Power BI activity event commandlet in PowerShell. So this commandlet is actually a wrapper around a API call that we can do from Power BI. And it's a wrapper that handles some of the more complex logic for us, which means that it's actually as simple as calling this commandlet with two mandatory parameters. And yes, these are mandatory because the activity event can only return so many records at a single time. So we have to call it on the highest possible granularity is a single day that we do it. So right now I'm calling a specific day. Why am I doing this? Because I'm running this on a tenant that is barely used and I know for a fact that there are records on that day. So as soon as I have this, I'll dump it into a PowerShell variable and I'll run an explicit select. Why am I doing this? Well, I'm a SQL person, and I've always been trained that select star from something is not a good practice, because especially with these APIs, new fields get added daily. And if we have logic built on this, it's potentially that new fields break that logic. For instance, I had a client running integration services on this, and well, integration services and flat files, they don't work together all that well. Which means that I'm connected already, so I can just go ahead and execute this block, if I wanted to, and then this is going to give me back, if I have some patience, this is going to give me back a lot of results. Well, not that much of results, but it's going to give me back every single activity that has been running, which means that this is all potentially some really interesting information for me to actually be starting to be able to use this, to actually know who has been doing what inside of my tenant. For instance, I have been getting gateway information, and I have been getting gateway clusters as well. I've been viewing dashboards, etc. So there's different things that pop up out of this. And you'll also notice that some events are a bit more critical than others, but I leave this up to you. So what I could also do is export this to a CSV file, and then if I've already done all of this, this will just pop up into different CSV files. For instance, if I look at this CSV file, nope, that's the wrong one. If I look at this CSV file, this is going to give me if I look at this CSV file, it's just going to give me a lot of information in there, which pretty much boils down to the fact that what has been done, what are we using, and how are we looking at these things, which is pretty cool as well for me. But let's keep going on, because I do have other things to say. The other thing that I can't stress enough, is that we need to look at an artifact inventory. What I mean with an artifact inventory is reports, dashboards, workspaces, datasets, dashboards, all these kinds of things. We can also extract these, and we can use this to build out a proper star schema around the activity log that we've already seen, which means that we can actually look for a bit more details in heavily used artifacts or not so heavily used artifacts. And the thing is as well is these days it's a lot more interesting to get this information because of the new admin APIs that have been released somewhere in August as well. And these admin APIs allow us to, with a single call, get a lot of the information tied to workspaces. So I'll be showing that in a bit as well, but it is also pretty useful to start looking at what are we actually doing with these artifacts. And most importantly, do I have some very sensitive information? Then yes, I'll definitely want to be looking at these things. I'll definitely want to keep a closer eye on these and start looking at these with a bit more of monitoring. But one important thing to keep in mind as well is that if you're trying to automate these kinds of scripts and extractions, a service principal is the road ahead. Meaning there are some changes coming around the June timeframe, possibly, likely, that the basic authentication will no longer be supported, and it is either required to authenticate through MFA, multi-factor authentication, or service principals or some other form, which means that just supplying as a user and a password will no longer be working. But it is also, when we're looking at these things for artifacts, Melissa Coates as well has a very interesting slide on this, because she refers to this as the typical Power BI auditing solution. But I've also noticed that the further down we go to the right, the less I actually see it happening inside of the wild at customers, which means that people, yes, they get audit logs. Sometimes they get some information as well for workspaces and security groups. The Graph API, I see that less and less, and the gateways, they are really underused as well. But it is also important to start storing that data somewhere, CSV files or whatever, start getting that into a database, either in the cloud or on premises, and building some actual proper reports on this, so that everyone can actually see what has been going on with your Power BI tenant. So I also have some scripts to start extracting these things, which is pretty much the same thing, where I can go ahead and authenticate and just start using this thing called the invoke Power BI REST method, which allows me to call an API. And this API in this instance is the admin API for capacities, for instance. And if I execute this, this is going to give me a list of all the capacities I have in my tenant, which in this tenant is just plain and simple the premium per user tenant as well. But if I wanted to do the same thing for, let's say, reports as well, it can give me a very simple overview of all the different reports that I have in there and the reports that I can possibly start using with this. Again, I can start exporting these to a CSV file, and because of the fact that I actually start linking these to the workspace that is calling it, I can actually have as well some sort of lineage based on what we're doing with this. Some sort of lineage that I can use later on to easily link all the different artifacts together. I'll make sure that these scripts also get uploaded to a GitHub, and I'll write a blog post for this as well, so that you can start using this as well. But there are some other examples included in the slide deck that you can also look at in the references at the end. But let's get cracking on. Because the other most important thing, another very important thing to keep in mind is tenant settings. And I cannot stress enough that this is actually the part where you, as an admin, define what usage can be done with your Power BI tenant, which means that it's very important for you to keep this under control, the way that you want it to be controlled. Because remember what I said in the very beginning, that it's not just about restricting things, but it's making sure that people are enabled to do things for themselves. But looking at tenant settings, they are all included in the admin portal. And this means that we can use this admin portal to control behavior. But right now, there is no easy way of making sure that we can automatically gather what tenant settings are set, which means that it's a very good practice, a best practice even, to document settings, especially the sensitive ones that have a big impact on your organization. Because as well, is that by default, it's not that easy to get information when a tenant setting is changed, and it's even less easy to get the actual information of what was changed, because the activity log does log an action called updated tenant feature switch, but it doesn't say which switch was activated. It doesn't say which setting was updated, which means that we know something. But if we haven't documented this, then we're not going to know what actually changed. There is a solution. I have not tested this in practice myself, but I have seen Melissa Coates reference it. Is that the Cloud App Security Center can set up an alert and email with the specific information that is logged in there. So Melissa has blogged about this, so I do highly encourage you to go look at this if you want to know more about this specific solution. These tenant settings, they can all be scoped to enable or disable behavior, which all of them can do. And then it means that you can apply this setting to either your entire organization or include, exclude groups based on what your preferences is. Because if you go ahead and disable a feature, you can say that, well, except for these people. Or if you can go ahead and disable it, then you can also say these people should be included and these people should not be included. But as a general tip, as a general reminder, I do encourage you to work with Office 365 mail-enabled security groups. Why is this? Because they have the broadest possibilities of uses inside of Power BI. And the link I've included in this slide by Formou or Gilbert Quevauvier actually has a very good write-up about where you can use which type of group. And it boils down to the fact that you can use the mail-enabled security groups at almost every single place as well. But I do encourage you, when you're looking at tenant settings, that you need to look with special attention, with special care for your workspace settings, and the export and sharing settings, and the Power BI visuals. Why is this? Well, the workspace settings, they pretty much control who can create workspaces and potentially even who can go ahead and assign workspaces to premium capacities or premium per user capacity. The export and sharing settings define who can actually export data to an Excel file or to a PowerPoint file or print reports, etc. So potentially, who can share, who can export your sensitive data to an unsecured environment? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It depends on the kind of data that we're using. But also Power BI Visuals is meant to be limited, meant to limit which types of visuals we can use. So as a rule of thumb, I usually say go for certified visuals and add an exception list, depending on how far you want to take this, but also depending on how many custom visuals are already used inside of your organization. But I will get back to that as well, because we're going to take a look at tenant settings right now. And tenant settings, will have to get this out of here as well, so you can actually see this thing. Tenant settings, they can be accessed through clicking the three little dots on the top right of the window, going to settings, and then making sure that we're at admin portal. And why I minimize my window a bit, well, got it from maximize, is because otherwise my big old ugly head would have been on top of that. But if we're inside of this admin portal, this means that we need to go over to our tenant settings, and we can get all the different tenant settings that we even have in there. And something important that you need to keep in mind as well is when new settings appear, they will be enabled or disabled by default, based on the fact that are they going to alter existing behavior. So if it's if it's new features that Microsoft wants to encourage, they will be enabled by default. If it's splitting out a existing behavior that has already been there, it will be disabled by default unless it's changing or altering existing behavior. So that's important to keep in mind. Meaning, scan the admin portal regularly to look for new tenant settings, because they do pop up on a very regular basis. I've known. So, as I mentioned, the workspace settings are a very important one to keep in mind here. Meaning, it boils down to who can create workspaces, who can actually go ahead and use these data sets across different workspaces, but most importantly, who can actually, can we actually still create classic workspaces or not? Meaning, Office 365 groups that possibly have nothing to do with Power BI. The second someone creates a SharePoint page, an Office 365 group, a Teams, whatever, you'll end up with Power BI workspaces as well. And is that a bad thing? No, but I can effectively tell you that 5 of the workspaces that I'm in, actually 2 of them are actually workspaces, which means that potentially on a tenant that is actually used a lot, you'll see plenty more of these workspaces pop up. But do with it what you must. The thing is as well is that when we're looking at these export and sharing settings, that's where you have to pay some really good attention to determine the kind of behavior that we want to encourage. For instance, there's been a lot of blogs published about this one, a lot of talks being done about publish to web. So if you're not aware of this, it should definitely be looked into to getting this under control, because it could potentially lead to some very nasty occurrences of data loss that you don't want to have. And then it's a matter of, will you allow people to export to CSV files, to actually download report files, to make sure that they can use live connections to other Power BI files, etc. So there are very granular possibilities to start limiting or start changing this behavior for certain people. And then as well, with the Power BI Visuals, that's where I actually wanted to go to as well, because that's making the bridge to the next segment, is that we can actually go ahead and make sure that we can actually only use certified visuals. And on this tenant, I don't have it enabled, because it's pretty much only used when I have something to demo. But this means, if I enable this, that only certified visuals from the app source will be allowed on top of the already native visuals from Power BI. So a certified visual, if you go to the app source, will have this little blue check mark next to it. And those are the ones that you can use. Why is this? Because the certified visuals go through a very rigorous auditing procedure, where you actually have to give up your code and it's being reviewed, and you have to answer some very specific questions to get it certified as well. Does that mean that visuals that are added to the app source marketplace are unsafe? No, because there are some basic checks occurring on this. But it does mean that if a user finds a visual somewhere on some obscure GitHub page or whatever other site they're browsing, it means that that visual could potentially be leaking your data to somewhere else, which is something that we usually want to be avoiding. So my advice typically, and this is me already bridging to the next part, is making sure that this tenant setting is enabled, that we enable it for everyone, and that we go over to this thing called Organisational Visuals, where we can actually go ahead and do something else. Meaning, right now, only certified visuals are allowed inside of my tenant. But I can actually go ahead and add visuals that I know and trust, that I've reviewed as an admin to my organization. For instance, an HTML viewer is a common one that comes back as well, or certain Gantt chart types as well. So these are actually visuals that you've reviewed yourself and that you do want to make sure that are aware. As an advice from myself, go for the app source ones, because they automatically check for newer versions. If you do it by a file base, that means that, well, if a new version pops up, you are the one responsible for making sure that this version is updated all over the place. So potentially could lead to a lot of work for you. So the question I get a lot when I talk about this specific is, well, we've actually never bothered to do this, and we don't know how many custom visuals are in my organization. Can we get this information somehow? Short answer, no. The longer answer, the more complex answer, probably, but you would have to scan each Power BI file that you have inside of your organization, which is not that easy. So typically how I've handled it as customers is send out communications to report builders that are known and report people that actually actively use this and ask, are you using custom visuals? Because we are going to do this, that, and we want to make sure that we have an inventory of visuals we want to take along with us inside of this story. And then as soon as you have the list, you make sure that they are added inside of this list and swap over the connection setting. So if people have actually been honest and upfront and have let you know what types of visuals they're using, this is going to go down without a hitch. And otherwise, well, you'll probably hear some people scream, which is also how you know which visuals are being used and which visuals are being used actively. That's the most important thing. So as I mentioned, boils down to making sure the setting is enabled and adding those visuals that you trust and approve. But another really important one as well is, how is my data, who can actually access my data? Well, access, in short, is determined by who has access to the workspace, who has access to the application, the workspace application, who has received this report by manual sharing, who has received dataset permissions directly on the dataset, and additionally, who is included in the row level security for roles. So the combination of these five bullets makes that someone can access your report and the underlying data, and depending on the fact if they have this thing called build permissions, they can actually build their own reports on top of this. So it is important to keep in mind, because I actually have gotten a lot of questions saying, well, we've got this finance data set, but we actually don't know who can use it, which means that you have to go check each and every single one of these things, because right now there is no automatic way of making sure that you can get this information out of there. Will it arrive in the future? I hope so. We'll have to wait and see for it to actually pop up, which is also another reason why I typically advise to not go overboard on manual report sharing and go for as many shared data sets as possible, because it does make your tenant administration, it does make your administration a lot easier. Important to keep in mind as well is that if someone is included inside of your workspace, they will not have row-level security applied to them, and they will have implicit build permissions if they are an administrator, a member, or a contributor. Very important to keep in mind. Why is this? Well, they can actually change the row level security themselves if they have any of these roles. The same thing with the build permissions. So people that have a role other than viewer are meant to be collaborating and meant to actually manage these things themselves as well. And as I mentioned before, it is an important thing to keep in mind to monitor your key assets very closely. And an admin can give access to anyone in all V2 workspaces. A Power BI admin or a global admin can give themselves access to any V2 workspace. So do be careful with who you assign the admin role. Because if everyone's an admin, no one's an admin. Then, gateways. Gateways are very often not handled properly and, well, not taken into account the way they should be. In short, gateways handle communication and data transport between your on-premises environment and the cloud environments. And they make sure that user authentication and authorization are handled as well. We have gateways for many different things, but specifically for Power BI, we have a personal gateway, an on-premises data gateway, personal mode, or an on-premises data gateway enterprise mode. And users that have privileges, that have permissions on this gateway, can publish new data sets and reports based on the data sources that they have access rights to. The thing is that by default, anyone in your organization can actually go ahead and install these gateways, which means that if you're trying to lock down things, if you're trying to streamline things, and someone can just go ahead and pop up a new gateway, they'll potentially open up your corporate data because you're not actively monitoring this resource, which means that you actually do need to have a view of which gateways do you have and debate if you can actually have personal gateways in your organization or not, because personal gateways are, well, they're a recipe for leading a gazillion Excel files into the internet. And right now, for reasons other than having Python or R data sources, they don't really have a use at this point. Meaning, why am I saying this? Because of the fact that you can actually go ahead and store those Excel files, etc. You can go ahead and store those in OneDrive, and then you don't even need a gateway anymore. Which is something that you do want to keep in mind. But also, gateways, they require resources, which is something that a lot of people are not aware of. Because, in a nutshell, because this is me sharing a few tips and tricks, when we're applying query folding, which means sending transformations back to our data sources, and query folding can no longer be applied, these transformations will be executed on the gateway machine. Which means that if the gateway machine is a very big bottleneck with only 4 gigabytes of RAM and 1 core, your refreshes are going to be very slow. So at this point, Luca Zavarella, an Italian MVP, is writing a series on LinkedIn, on Medium, and I've included the link as well, and he's going deeper into why this is something important to keep in mind and how you can actually go ahead and start doing this. And I do recommend reading this as well. But if I go to the Power Platform Admin Center and go to Data Preview, this is where I can actually get easily an overview of, well, what gateways are running in personal mode, in which different regions and tenants regions they're running, or enterprise modes as well. Which means that you can easily get a view of, well, what gateways are out there, who is actually monitoring this, who is actually doing something with this, and we can also go ahead and limit the behavior if people can actually install gateways or not. And right now, no one can install it except for this random guy called Benny, which means that I would be the only one that can actually install gateways inside of my tenant, for instance. But you can also limit this with security groups, etc., and then people can actually they can do this themselves as well. So for me, this was a real eye-opener, because before that, it wasn't that easy to actually know who's been doing something with it as well, who's been using gateways. But one last thing, premium per user has been added to the Power BI landscape somewhere around September at Ignite, which means that we have a scoped premium dedicated capacity, which can be assigned based on a usage. Which means that for a possibly very interesting price point, users can actually go ahead and start using these preview features at a very interesting price point. But by default, this behavior means that people can assign themselves an in-product trial experience. By default, they can also create workspaces through themselves and actually assign them to a Power BI Premium per user capacity as well, which means that end users could potentially be building some serious production level dependencies on a preview feature with a pricing that is not known yet. So am I convinced that this will be huge in the future? Yes, but I am very wary at this point because not all the information that I'd want to be knowing is known at this point. How do we actually know who's been doing something with this? Well, we get the workspace inventory, we get the capacity inventory, we get the licenses, and we track down the Power BI activity log. But I've also written a blog for this that you can go ahead and look at to make sure that you have this information as well. So monitoring is a topic that you can go very, very deep in. Another MVP called Mark Ladyveld, he has a full-fledged session on this to build out an end-to-end monitoring solution. But there are some steps that you can actually very easily set up, because if you have extracted those activity logs, you can go ahead and build a Power BI dashboard tile with a data alert on this, making sure that you pin some tiles with some actions that you want to be seeing, and then put a simple count measure on there, which means that if the actions in the last 48 hours go above 1, then you get an email and then you can need to go ahead and look at this. So this is a very quick and dirty and easy mode, but it does allow you to get something up and running quickly while you can do other things or while you can investigate other solutions. Lastly, as a tenant admin, it is important to stay updated. And the most important resources that you can use for this is, well, look at the Power BI roadmap, especially because right now the Power Platform Release Wave 1 for 2021 has been released, the Power BI blog, and then the many community authors and initiatives that pop up around the world. One thing to keep in mind is check the release dates, as information ages extremely quickly these days. Something that you've written 4 months ago could potentially also be, well, not as interesting anymore because it all changed drastically. That said, let's get down to some takeaways. These 40 minutes-ish, I've tried to convince you to make sure to set up an extraction process for the Power BI activity logs and your artifacts as well. To make sure that you scope your tenant settings for certain key areas based on the usage patterns that you will have for your organization. And making sure that you have some form of alerting set up for external service outages, but also for the usage on your internal tenant. Who's doing what? Who's actually trying what sort of features on there? And then making sure that rolling forward, you do get these data gateways logged and monitored, because they really, really keep an insane amount of information there. I didn't dive into this very deeply as well, but a data culture is a very important thing as well. And we are seeing some really interesting materials pop up by people like Melissa Coates or Matthew Roach or Mark Ladyveld. But you as a tenant admin, try to keep updated because it is moving very, very fast. But also, well, we can't know everything. So Googling things is natural, and Google or Binging things is actually a very, very healthy process, because that also means that you're trying to learn new things as well. To close off, one simple code as well is to remind you that self-service BI isn't made by products and technology. It is people, methodologies, and processes that enable this as well. Because we can use Power BI, Tableau, or whatever, but if people don't talk to each other, if people don't make agreements and live up to these agreements, then every single product will start failing as well. It is about getting that data culture up and running as well. But there are a bunch of references in here that you can use. They're all included in the slide deck. I'll make sure this is uploaded by the time the event actually takes place, and some very interesting things for you to look at. That said, my contact details are on this slide again. Feel free to hit me up. I'll definitely try to hit any questions you have. And well, if there's anything, do reach out to me as well. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you in person soon. Thank you.